I'm probably about to say some things that aren't going to make sense at first, so stick with me. Because by the end of this, I want you to look at the word vulnerability a little differently. I've talked about this word before. A while back, I went down a pretty deep rabbit hole trying to understand where this word actually came from and what it actually meant. But it made me start questioning something bigger. How much of what we believe about words is based on what they originally meant? And how much is based on what we've been taught the meaning is today? Take vulnerability. When we hear that word today, what do we think of? Being emotionally exposed, opening up about your feelings, showing somebody your weaknesses, maybe even letting somebody see the parts of you that could potentially be used against you. That's how we commonly understand vulnerability today. But let's go back. The word ultimately comes from the Latin vulnus, which means wound. And vulnere, probably butchered that, means to wound, hurt, or injure. When vulnerable entered the English language in the early 1600s, it meant being capable of being physically wounded. I want you to catch that. We're talking about a physical wound, not your trauma, not your insecurities, not your emotions. A literal wound. Then, as the word continued to be used in English, its meaning expanded. By the late 1600s, it was being used figuratively for being defenseless against things that weren't physical. And that eventually grew into the broader meaning that we use today. Now, I'm not saying that language doesn't evolve. Of course it does. But here's where I want you to think with me. What happens when a word evolves so much that we forget where it started? Because we don't just inherit words, we inherit the meanings attached to them. And we use those meanings so often that eventually we stop questioning them. We just accept it. And that's what I think is worth looking at. Not because every modern definition is wrong, but because sometimes going back to the root gives you a completely different perspective on something that you thought you already understood. And that's what happened for me with vulnerability. Because now, when I hear that word, I don't just think about the modern definition. I think about where it began, a physical wound. Something capable of being wounded. And that makes me wonder, how many other words, ideas, or even beliefs have we simply accepted because that's the version that we've been handed? What if, instead of just asking, what does this mean, we start asking, where did this meaning come from? What was the original idea? What changed? What might have gotten lost along the way? Because maybe changing the way that we think doesn't always mean learning something completely new. Sometimes it means going back to where it started, back to the root. That's where we find something that we didn't even realize we'd lost.